Boston, spring of 1973. The city was in bloom again, its brownstone facades warmed by the sun, tulips rising in the public garden, and the swan boats gliding slowly across the pond. Children's laughter carried through the air, mingling with the sound of church bells and the faint rustle of newspapers being folded on park benches. Life had moved on from the shadow of the war, but in quiet corners, memories still lingered, unspoken, yet alive. Every morning, Mary, now 52, walked from her apartment near Beacon Hill down to Boston Common. Her steps were steady, her path unchanged for decades, leading her to the same wooden bench beneath the old elm trees. She always sat in the same place, her coat neatly buttoned, her hair tied back, and beside her the same leather bag she had carried for years. Inside that bag lay the secret of her life. A bundle of letters, carefully tied with ribbon, yellowed by time, written in her steady hand. Letters addressed to one man. His name was John. They had met during the last desperate days of World War II, when the world seemed to be ending, but love had dared to begin. John was young, serving in the US Army, stationed in Europe in early 1945. Mary was 24 then, working in a small dress shop in Boston, helping her widowed mother, dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. They had only a handful of weeks together before John shipped out. On their last day, sitting on that very bench in the Common, he promised he would write. She promised she would wait. Mary waited. She wrote her first letter a week after he left, then another and another. She wrote of the changing seasons, the songs of sparrows in the park, the loneliness that grew heavier with each passing year. She wrote about her mother's illness, about the dresses she stitched, about the world rebuilding itself after so much ruin. She wrote because it kept him alive in her heart, but no answer ever came. She never sent the letters. She had no address to send them to, no certainty of where he was. Rumors spread of soldiers lost, captured, missing in action. John's name appeared on no official list. To most, he was gone, but not to her. To her, he was still alive somewhere, and the letters became her way of reaching him, even if only across silence. For nearly 3 decades, Mary carried those letters with her, reading them quietly on the bench as though he were there, listening. The neighbors thought of her as a solitary woman, polite but reserved, someone who never remarried, more in memory than in the present. They didn't know that every day she sat with the weight of love in her hands, bound together by paper and faith. And then, on an ordinary spring morning, something extraordinary happened. As Mary adjusted her bag on the bench, an older man sat down beside her. He was bent with age, his shoulders heavy, a worn hat held carefully in his hands. He didn't speak. He simply sat there, his presence quiet but undeniable. She turned slightly, just enough to see him. And in the way he held his hat, in the stillness of his hands, in the silence between them, she recognized him. Her breath caught. The world seemed to stop. It was John. After all these years, if this story touches you the way it touched me while writing, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to share real stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready. Because what comes next changes everything. For most people, the benches in Boston Common and the public garden were just places to pause, somewhere to tie a shoelace, read a newspaper, or sip coffee on the way to work. Couples carved their initials into the wood, children climbed up and jumped off, tourists rested their feet after walking the Freedom Trail. But for Mary, one bench had been more than wood and iron. It had been her sanctuary, her chapel, the one place where memory and waiting could exist side by side. Nearly 30 years had passed since the war ended, yet Mary's routine had never changed. Every morning, just after 9, she left her small apartment on Beacon Hill, walking past the corner bakery where the smell of warm bread spilled out into the street, past the old bookshop that leaned slightly to one side, down Charles Street, until the trees of the garden opened before her. She knew every stone, every fountain, every turn. And always her path ended at the same bench by the pond, beneath the branches of the elm trees. She always sat on the left side, leaving the right side empty. To the strangers passing by, it was simply a habit, perhaps superstition. But to her, it was something else entirely, a promise kept alive through silence. That empty space was John's, held for him since the day he had left in 1945. The bag at her side carried the weight of her devotion. Inside, wrapped carefully in cloth, were the letters she had written year after year. Some were creased from being read too many times, others still smelled faintly of ink. They were her diary and her prayer. Each began with "Dear John" and ended with "Yours, Mary." They told of Boston winters heavy with snow, springs filled with blossoms, summers when she listened to jazz on the radio, autumns when the leaves burned red and gold in the common. They told of her mother's illness, of neighbors moving away, of dresses she sewed for weddings she herself would never attend. They told of loneliness, but also of faith. Faith that he was alive somewhere, faith that love could outlast silence. People in the neighborhood came to know her as the lady with the letters. She was kind but reserved, polite but distant. She never remarried. She filled her days with sewing, with the company of sparrows on the bench, with walks along the Charles River. To the outside world she appeared alone, but she knew she wasn't. John had never truly left her. He lived in every line she wrote, in every page she folded and tied with ribbon. On that morning in 1973, when the man sat beside her, Mary's instinct was not to look at him. She kept her gaze on the water as she always did. She noticed his hands first. They trembled slightly as he held his hat, not with carelessness but with reverence, as though it was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. His shoulders were bent, his frame leaner than she remembered. But there was something in the way he carried stillness, something achingly familiar. Silence stretched between them. It was not the silence of strangers, awkward and restless. It was a silence filled with recognition, though neither dared to speak it aloud. The air seemed heavier, the sounds of children playing and geese calling faded into the background. She dared a glance at his face, weathered, marked by time. Eyes that had seen too much, yet behind the years she saw it. Him. Second day, he returned. Again, he sat quietly beside her. Again, no words were spoken, but Mary knew then that this was no accident. On the third day, she did something she had never done before. She pulled one of the old letters from her bag, a letter dated October 1947, and placed it on her lap. She didn't unfold it, didn't read it. She simply rested her hand on it, waiting. For a moment, she wondered if he would notice. He did. He glanced down, then away, as though he couldn't bear the weight of it. Her voice came softly, barely above the rustle of leaves. "Do you believe someone can wait decades for an answer?" At first, he didn't respond. His eyes stayed on the pond, the ripples carrying bits of light across the water. Then he turned slowly and looked at her. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, almost broken but steady. "Yes," he said, "because I'm still trying to answer the first one." The world seemed to hold its breath. For Mary, time collapsed. All the years of silence, of doubt, of hope too fragile to speak aloud, became real in that single sentence. He was here, he was alive, and he had never truly forgotten. The year 1945 arrived in Boston with grey skies and a stubborn wind off the harbor, the kind that rattled window panes and made even the bravest pedestrians tuck their chins into their coats. Yet under that winter light, the city held its breath and waited for an ending that felt close enough to touch and a beginning no one could yet name. Mary was 24, a seamstress at a small shop just off Newbury Street, where brides' gowns were carefully unpicked and reimagined into Sunday dresses, where ration coupons were counted like prayer beads, and where she learned to make beauty out of whatever fabric the times would allow. Her father had died years earlier, Her mother's health had grown fragile, and Mary's world had narrowed to patterns and pins and the quiet companionship of the radio, which hummed big band records by night and war bulletins by dawn. Boston felt at once safe and far away. No bombs, no blackouts now, only the soft discipline of rationing and the steady march of troop trains through South Station. Yet every newsboy's cry, every flag in a window, every blue star in a tenement pane reminded her that the city's heart beat in time, with ships departing the harbor. She met John in line at a corner diner on Boylston, where the smell of coffee and the sizzle of eggs on a steel griddle rose like a small mercy, and where uniforms mixed with work coats in a fellowship of routine that ignored rank and fear for 15 brief minutes at a time. He stepped back so she could pay first, tipping his garrison cap with a shy flourish that made him seem younger than his years. And when she dropped a nickel, he stooped to pick it up with the same careful hands that would later hold hers, as if they were a fragile, necessary thing. He spoke softly, the trace of a Midwestern cadence rounding his syllables, and when he laughed, it was as though a window had opened in the room. They sat side by side at the counter, shared a plate of toast because butter was precious, and walked afterward through the public garden, where the swan boats had not yet returned, but the pond still caught the pale light and threw it back like a promise. In those quick weeks, stolen from a city that had too much to do and too much to fear, they found a rhythm that felt both ordinary and absolute. A cup of coffee before Mary's shift, a stroll along Commonwealth Avenue Mall, where the trees stood bare but stubborn, a Sunday at church where she folded his name into her prayers with the same care she used to fold batiste and taffeta. He told her about his farm childhood in Indiana, about the way the fields looked after a summer storm, and about the men he'd trained with who could not stop joking on the worst days, because if they didn't laugh, they might not move at all. She told him about Boston's narrow streets, about her mother's quiet strength, about the dresses she dreamed of sewing for women whose lives were large enough to demand celebration. Each story was an offering, a way of saying, there is more to me than the war will let you see. And each day they stitched those offerings together until they felt, improbably, like a life. The order to ship out came the way so much news comes, on a plain sheet of paper that could not capture the thing it commanded, and John folded it into his pocket with a care that made Mary's throat tighten, as if careful hands might pacify a future already raging. They met on the bench in the common just after dawn, the city not yet awake, frost still clinging to the grass, and for a long time they did not speak because words felt like weak boats set onto a current too strong to survive. She pressed a handkerchief into his palm, white cotton with her initials stitched in the corner, a small domestic defiance against a world that had grown coarse and loud. He gave her his cap ribbon, a narrow strip of dark fabric he had tucked away since basic training, and the way he tied it around her wrist, quick, neat, determined, made her believe that a knot could be a vow. They sat until the sun finally found them through the trees. And when he rose, he promised to write as soon as he knew where he was going, and she promised to wait, because words are sometimes all we have, and sometimes more than we deserve. The first letter she wrote a week later, the shop radio carrying crackling reports from Europe, while she set her pen to a page torn from the heavy stationery sold by Jordan Marsh downtown. The paper faintly perfumed from a display counter that still remembered better days. "Dear John," she wrote, and told him about the late snow that melted in an hour, about the boy who sold newspapers with a voice too big for his jacket, about the new pattern she'd drafted for a dress that would bloom despite the lack of silk and lace. "Yours, Mary," she ended, and sealed it with nothing more than breath, because the envelope had no address and she could not bring herself to hand a letter to the world with nowhere to go. The second letter came as easily as the first, then a third. Pages that turned weeks into chapters, each one a way of keeping him inside the lines of her days. Spring stretched toward May, and victory rumors walked the streets ahead of themselves like proud, unruly children. On VE Day, the city sang, church bells ringing until hands blistered and voices grew hoarse, and Mary stood in the square with tears on her face that she could not name. Relief braided with fear, because endings are often just doors to rooms we have not yet learned how to enter. She wrote to John that night by candlelight, describing soldiers dancing with strangers in the streets, describing her mother falling asleep in a chair with the radio still on, describing a quiet that felt heavier than noise, as if the future itself had sat down at their kitchen table and folded its arms. She told him she would keep writing until he wrote back, and when no address arrived, she kept that promise, because a promise, once said aloud, becomes a kind of architecture inside you, and you learn to live in its rooms. Summer brought heat and ration lines that were shorter but still not gone, and Mary's letters turned from length to detail. The first tomatoes ripening in a neighbor's victory garden, the way that Charles looked at dusk when the sky decided to remember its own colors, the taste of the first orange she'd had in years, peeled slowly as if reverence could extend sweetness. She wrote about the shop's first real wedding gown after the war, sat up late to describe its seam allowances and tiny covered buttons, because she wanted John to know that beauty had not surrendered, not entirely, and that if he returned, there would be music left in the world to meet him. When fall came, she wrote of the common blazing red, of geese honking overhead, of the ache in her hands that grew worse with the cold, yet never once kept her from writing. News of men returning traveled like weather, sudden, changeable, unfair, yet his name never appeared, not in the Globe, not in a letter to a neighbor, not on any list read aloud after church. And after a time, people stopped asking, because absence is a subject that exhausts even the kind. Mary began to keep the letters tied with ribbon in a wooden box her father had once used for cufflinks, and each time she placed another inside, she whispered his name, not because she believed he could hear it across an ocean and years, but because gratitude demanded ritual. She kept her promises in small ways, an extra place set on holidays, a walk through the garden at the hour of their first coffee, until the habits themselves became a map of a city that still belonged to both of them. Sometimes, late at night, the radio carried stories from far places, rumors of men missing during the chaos of the last push east, of names misplaced in transit camps, of files that did not match faces, and she would turn the volume down and let those stories hover in the room like sparks that might, if tended, become a flame. She did not entertain fantasies. She did not rehearse reunion speeches. She did not rewrite his absence into something noble. Instead, she wrote the next letter, and then the next, tracing the days so that if he ever returned, he could step into the shape of a life that had saved a seat for him. Years slid forward the way years do, quietly, insistently, a tide so patient you mistake it for stillness, until 1973 arrived, and Mary found herself older than she imagined she would be, still sitting on the bench where their last morning had ended, still carrying the letters that had taught her how to live with both faith and doubt. What she could not know as she tied that ribbon one more time was that John had been traveling his own long road back, a road that would lead him through other names and other towns, and the painful work of learning how to stand again in his own skin, and that the first thing it would carry him to, when at last it brought him home, was the bench where a space had been kept for him all along. For John, coming back to Boston was never a homecoming. It was a return through shadows, a journey into a city that remembered itself differently than he did. After the war, when the guns fell silent in Europe, his own silence began, not chosen, but imposed. He had been among the men captured near the Elbe in the chaotic final weeks of 1945, shipped eastward by Soviet soldiers to a place that had no maps and no names. He spent years there, not as a soldier anymore, but as a number, surviving winters that burned the skin and summers that dried the lungs. When release finally came, it was not freedom, not really. He was handed papers that called him someone else, Another man's name, another man's birthplace. To argue was to risk being swallowed again by the machine, so he carried the false identity like a stone in his pocket. Back in the States, he could not find his way to Boston, not immediately. He drifted instead. Small towns in the Midwest, labor on farms, construction in places where no one asked questions. He spoke little, trusted less. Nights were long, and sometimes he wrote Mary's name on scraps of paper just to see it written, then burned them before morning. Years turned into decades. He watched other men build lives, families, careers, houses that filled with children's laughter. He told himself Mary had done the same. Perhaps she had remarried. Perhaps she had forgotten him. Perhaps that was best. Better to imagine her alive in another man's arms than to consider she might still be waiting for a ghost. But in the spring of 1973, a distant cousin passed away in Boston, and John returned for the funeral. He walked through streets that felt both familiar and foreign, the red brick row houses, the Charles shimmering in the sunlight, the gold dome of the State House bright as ever. Yet for him, the city was haunted by absences. Every corner whispered of who he had been, not who he was now. Almost without knowing why, he wandered into the public garden. The elms were heavy with green. The swan boats moved lazily across the pond. He slowed his step as though something held him back, and then he saw her. Mary, sitting on the same bench, her hair now silver, her back straight, though her hands rested softly on her lap. Beside her was the familiar bag. He felt his chest collapse. For a moment he thought it was an illusion, some cruel mirage. But no, it was her. Not lost, not forgotten, but here. He could not approach that first day. He watched from a distance, hidden by the trees, as she opened the bag and lifted a bundle of letters. She touched them gently, like relics. He understood instantly what they were. His throat closed. The next morning he returned. This time he walked to the bench. He sat down at her side, careful not to speak. She did not look at him right away, but he felt her body stiffen, felt her breath catch. Still, neither of them said a word. The silence held them like a fragile thread. On the third day, Mary broke it. With a letter resting on her lap, she asked quietly, "Do you believe someone can wait decades for an answer?" John's reply came slowly, heavy with the weight of years. "Yes," he said, "because I'm still trying to answer the first one." It was then that the wall between them crumbled. Not with tears, not with embraces, but with a simple truth laid bare. In the days that followed, they found their way to each other again. They began meeting not only on the bench, but also at a small cafe near Charles Street. There, over steaming cups of coffee and the scent of apple pie, John finally spoke of what had happened. He told her of the capture, the camps, the nameless years. He told her how he had been released with papers that stripped him of himself, how he had drifted from place to place, never daring to seek her because he believed she had moved on. His voice faltered often, but Mary never interrupted. She listened, her eyes steady, her silence a balm. At last, she reached into her bag and set the box of letters on the table between them. He touched it as though it might shatter. That night, alone in his rented room, he opened it. He read the first letter dated March 1945, and then the next and the next. With every page, he felt himself pulled back into a life he thought lost forever. Her words carried the weight of seasons, of decades. They told him he had never been truly absent. He had lived in her ink, in her steadfast heart. He wept, not for what had been lost, but for the miracle that something still remained. From then on, their meetings carried a new rhythm. They did not talk of redoing the past. They did not dream of futures too fragile to hold. They spoke, instead of presence, of being here, now, together. They were not the young soldier and seamstress who had once promised eternity. They were two survivors of silence, learning again the language of trust. The cafe on Charles Street became their refuge. From the outside, it looked like nothing special. Red brick walls, a chalkboard sign advertising clam chowder and coffee, the bell above the door jingling each time someone came in. But for Mary and John, it was a place where years could fold into one another, where the noise of the present softened enough to let the past breathe. Always chose the same table near the window, from which they could see the branches of the public garden bending over the pond. There, with cups of coffee warming their hands, they began a dialogue that was not about explanations or apologies, but about weaving two broken timelines into something whole. One afternoon, Mary set a small wooden box on the table. It was wrapped in cloth, the corners worn smooth from decades of being opened and closed. She slid it toward him without a word. John looked at it for a long time before lifting the lid. Inside lay the letters, bound with faded ribbon, hundreds of pages filled with her careful script. He touched them as though they might dissolve under his fingers. "I wrote them all for you," she said softly. "Every season, every year." That night, back in his room, he began to read. He read until dawn, his hands trembling over each page. They carried her voice across decades. The scent of lilacs in spring, the bitter cold of a Boston winter, the loneliness that stretched across her days, the stubborn hope that refused to die. Every line told him he had never been erased from her life, even when he had believed himself forgotten. When they met again the next day, John placed the box back on the table. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "I've read them all, and in every one I've found you." Mary reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. It was not a gesture of possession, but of peace. There were no tears, only the quiet knowledge that they had both survived not only war, but the long silence that followed. From then on, their meetings took on a rhythm of their own. Mary continued to write letters, but no longer in solitude. She wrote them sitting beside him, her pen moving across fresh paper while he watched. They were short now, sometimes just a line. "The geese are back at the pond today," or "I dreamed we were young again, walking by the Charles." She would fold the page, slide it across to him, and he would read it immediately. And then, slowly, John began to write as well. His handwriting was uneven, his hand sometimes unsteady, but the words came. "I'm grateful for today. Your voice still sounds the same. I never thought I would be allowed to return." Each note was like a breath released after years of holding it in. They filled a notebook together, page by page, a dialogue across time. It wasn't a chronicle of the past, nor a plan for the future. It was a record of presence, of two people existing side by side, finally allowed to answer each other. On the bench in the public garden, their conversations shifted from silence to gentle words. They spoke about the sparrows that landed at their feet, about the children racing by, about the seasons turning. But underneath these ordinary topics lay another conversation, unspoken yet clear. I waited, I returned. We are here. One misty afternoon in autumn, Mary handed him a letter different from all the rest. It was written on crisp white paper, undated. She placed it in his hands and said, "This one isn't for later, it's for now." He unfolded it slowly. The letter contained only a few lines. "We don't need to start over. We only need to be here, together while we can." When he looked up, she was watching him. He whispered one word, "Thank you." And in that word was everything he had never been able to say. They never spoke of the years they had lost, nor of the years that remained. They didn't call it a second chance or try to pretend they could recover youth. What they built was quieter, but perhaps stronger, a companionship born not of illusion but of endurance. For Mary, it meant she no longer wrote into silence. For John, it meant he no longer lived behind false names and empty rooms. Together, they found language again, not the language of promises, but of presence. They were, at last, answering each other. Winter came early that year. The public garden was dusted with snow, the pond frozen in thin glass, the swan boats locked away until spring. The bench where they sat together seemed almost like a monument now, half buried beneath the white, its wood worn smooth by decades of waiting. And yet, even in the cold, Mary and John came every day, wrapped in scarves and coats, sharing a wool blanket across their knees, sipping from a thermos of hot tea. To strangers, they were simply two older people keeping each other company. To themselves, they were proof that some promises never die. Conversations grew fewer as the days shortened. Sometimes they sat in silence, but it was no longer the silence of strangers or the silence of longing. It was the silence of presence, of knowing that the other was there. Mary still wrote her small letters. John still wrote his notes. Together, they filled page after page in a notebook they jokingly called the answer book. Every line was a thread, weaving their lives together at last. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes. Mary, once thought reserved and distant, now smiled more easily. Her steps on the cobblestones seemed lighter. John, who had always carried himself with the weariness of a man who had lived too long in shadows, now walked taller, his eyes clearer. No one around them knew the story that bound them. No one knew the weight of decades that had finally been lifted. But everyone could sense the warmth between them, a warmth that lingered even in the dead of winter. They never spoke of time lost. They never counted the years or asked what if. They knew that dwelling on absence would only steal from the present. Instead, they treated every day like a gift, a quiet holiday of its own. On a grey afternoon in December, Mary handed John a new letter. It was short, only one line. "I don't need the years we missed. I only need the days we have." He read it slowly, his hand trembling slightly, then placed it back in her palm and whispered, "That's enough." And it was. The bench became more than a seat in a park. For them, it was a testament to patience, to hope, to the endurance of love. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew that when one of them was gone, the other would keep coming back. Because that bench, in all its weathered ordinariness, was sacred now. Mary no longer signed her letters with "yours in hope" or "with longing." Instead, she wrote "with eternal love." Finally read. And for John, every word she gave him was the homecoming he had once thought impossible. So they sat together, day by day, survivors not only of war, but of silence, of forgetting, of time itself. They did not need to reclaim the past. They had found something rarer, the peace of knowing that love, once planted, never truly dies. It only waits. We share new stories every day. True stories that move and inspire. Tell us in the comments, which part of Mary and John's journey touched you the most?